The room sparkled under the glow of 1,000 crystal chandeliers, each refracting light across the soaring ceiling of the grand Manhattan ballroom. Guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos clinked glasses of champagne and exchanged pleasantries, their laughter rising above the delicate strains of a string quartet. It was a scene plucked straight from a high society fairy tale, but for Alexander Hart, it was just another event in an endless parade of obligations. Alex adjusted the cufflinks on his custom-made tuxedo, his practiced smile in place as he nodded at a cluster of socialites vying for his attention. With his sharp jawline, stormy gray eyes, and impeccably styled dark hair, he commanded the room effortlessly. To the outside world, he was the quintessential billionaire, charming, polished, and powerful. But inside, Alex felt like an actor playing a role in someone else's play. He stepped toward the open bar, letting the hum of conversation blur into the background. A staff member greeted him immediately, ready to pour his usual scotch. Alex waved it off with a polite gesture and reached instead for sparkling water. The burn of alcohol did little to distract him from the gnawing ache that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. "Mr. Hart, a moment of your time?" The voice belonged to Henry Gates, one of New York's most influential financiers. Alex turned, his expression cordial. He had mastered the art of small talk, of charming without committing, of being engaged while remaining utterly detached. It was the currency of his world, one he wielded like a second language. "Of course, Henry," Alex said smoothly, leaning in as the older man launched into a proposal about a new development venture. Alex nodded at the right moments, offering measured responses, but his thoughts wandered. As Henry's voice droned on, Alex's gaze drifted to the ornate ring on his right hand, a family heirloom with an intricate crest and a sapphire at its center. The ring had belonged to his sister, Isabel. He'd given it to her on her 16th birthday, a gift meant to symbolize their bond. Isabel had disappeared 3 years later, leaving no trace beyond a hastily scribbled note. Alex had spent years trying to track her down, exhausting every resource at his disposal. When the trail went cold, he buried the grief beneath layers of ambition, building the empire that now defined him. But no amount of wealth or power could fill the void Isabel had left behind. "Alex, are you listening?" Henry's tone snapped Alex back to the present. "My apologies, Henry." "Long day," Alex replied with a contrite smile. "Let's schedule a meeting next week to discuss this in detail. I'd like to give it the attention it deserves." Henry seemed placated, but as he walked away, Alex felt the familiar weight settle back on his shoulders. The glittering crowd around him felt distant, their laughter hollow. He longed for something real, something untarnished by pretense or ulterior motives. But in his world, sincerity was as rare as the diamonds dripping from the necks of the women in attendance. As Alex moved toward a quieter corner of the room, a soft tug on his jacket startled him. He glanced down to see a girl no older than 7, her curly brown hair framing a heart-shaped face. She clutched a stuffed bear in one hand, its fur worn and matted, and her wide hazel eyes stared at him with a mixture of curiosity and awe. "Hi," she said, her voice small but confident. Alex crouched slightly, his imposing frame lowering to meet her gaze. "Hello there. What's your name?" "Emma," she said, clutching her bear closer. "You have a pretty ring." Alex's heart skipped a beat as he followed her gaze to the sapphire on his hand. "Thank you, Emma. It's very special to me." "My mom has one just like it," Emma said matter-of-factly. Her words hung in the air, slicing through the noise of the gala as if she'd shouted them. "Your mom?" Alex asked, his tone measured. "What's her name?" Emma beamed. "Maggie. She says her ring is magic." Magic. The word sent a shiver down Alex's spine. Isabel had used the same word when he'd given her the ring. twirling it on her finger with a smile brighter than the sapphire itself. It had been their private joke, something only the two of them shared. "Where's your mom?" Alex asked gently. Emma turned and pointed toward a group of guests near the center of the room. Alex's gaze followed, landing on a woman with auburn hair tied in a loose bun, wearing a simple yet elegant navy dress. She wasn't laughing or gesturing wildly like the others. Instead, she observed quietly, her expression warm but guarded. "That's her," Emma said proudly. Alex's chest tightened. There was something familiar about the woman, though he couldn't place it. A spark of hope ignited within him, dangerous and exhilarating. Could Maggie really hold a piece of the puzzle he'd been chasing for so long? "Emma!" The woman's voice rang out, and she approached quickly, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She knelt beside the girl, her features softening as she looked at her daughter. "I told you to stay close." Emma grinned, unabashed. "I was talking to him." She pointed at Alex, whose imposing presence seemed to have no effect on the little girl. The woman stood, her expression shifting to one of polite suspicion. "I hope she wasn't bothering you." "Not at all," Alex said, his voice steady despite the questions swirling in his mind. "She has a good eye. This ring is special." The woman's gaze flicked to the sapphire, and for a fleeting moment, something passed over her features, a flicker of recognition, quickly masked. "Well, thank you for indulging her," she said, her tone neutral. "Come on, Emma, let's get you some dessert." As they walked away, Alex remained rooted in place, his heart pounding. He watched as the woman gently guided Emma back into the crowd, her hand resting protectively on the girl's shoulder. For the first time in years, Alex felt something stir within him, an urgency, a sense of possibility. He didn't know who Maggie was or why her daughter recognized the ring, but one thing was certain. He had to find out. The following evening, Alex found himself seated at the sleek, polished mahogany desk in his penthouse office, high above the noise of the city. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Manhattan's glittering skyline, but the view did little to distract him from the thoughts racing through his mind. The name lingered in his memory. Maggie. Who was she? And how had her daughter come to possess knowledge of the ring? An heirloom that should only have meaning to his family. Alex leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his fingers against the cool glass of a tumbler filled with sparkling water. His assistant Jonas entered, a folder tucked under his arm. "You wanted information on a Maggie Davis?" Jonas asked, glancing down at his notes as he placed the folder on the desk. "That's right." Alex leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "What did you find?" "She's a registered nurse at a small clinic in Fairfield, Connecticut," Jonas began. "Single mother. Moved there about 7 years ago. Before that, she was in upstate New York, working at a community hospital. No criminal record, no scandals. She's as straightforward as they come." Jonas hesitated, his professional mask faltering slightly. "But there's one thing that stood out. I dug into her public records, and there's no birth certificate listed for her daughter, Emma." Alex frowned. "What do you mean, no birth certificate?" "Emma's records only appear after Maggie moved to Fairfield. Before that, it's like she didn't exist." Alex's jaw tightened. The lack of a paper trail only deepened the mystery. He had no intention of prying into Maggie's life unnecessarily, but the connection between her and the ring couldn't be ignored. "Thank you, Jonas," Alex said, dismissing him with a nod. "I'll take it from here." Jonas hesitated, his loyalty evident in the lines etched into his face. "Be careful, Alex. Sometimes digging up the past comes with consequences." Alex didn't respond. Instead, he turned his chair toward the window, the city stretching out like a glittering sea before him. Jonas was right, but this wasn't just about curiosity. It was about answers. The next day, Alex decided to follow the trail to Fairfield. The clinic where Maggie worked was a modest building nestled between a diner and a library on a quiet street. It was a far cry from the glitz and glamour of Alex's usual world. The brick facade was chipped in places, and the wooden sign above the door creaked in the gentle breeze. Still, there was a warmth to the place, a charm that reminded Alex of simpler days. He stepped inside, the soft chime of a bell announcing his presence. The reception area was small but inviting, with worn leather chairs, children's books stacked neatly on a side table, and a faint smell of antiseptic in the air. "Can I help you?" The receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, smiled up at him. "I'm here to see Maggie Davis," Alex said, his voice measured. The woman's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. "She's with a patient right now. It'll be about 10 minutes. You're welcome to wait." Alex nodded, taking a seat by the window. As he waited, he observed the comings and goings of the clinic. Patients of all ages filtered in and out, greeted warmly by the staff. It was clear that this was more than just a workplace for Maggie. It was a community. The door to one of the exam rooms opened, and Maggie stepped out, her auburn hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She wore a crisp white coat, her expression calm and professional as she spoke to a patient's family. When her eyes landed on Alex, surprise flashed across her face. "Mr. Hart," she said, approaching him with a wary smile. "I wasn't expecting to see you again." "Call me Alex," he replied, standing to greet her. "I hope I'm not intruding." Her gaze softened, though her guard was still up. "Not at all. What brings you here?" Alex hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "Your daughter mentioned something at the gala, about a ring that resembles this one." He held up his hand, the sapphire catching the light. "It got me thinking about my own family, and I realized I might owe you and Emma an apology for prying." Maggie's posture relaxed slightly, but her smile remained cautious. "It's just a ring," she said lightly. "But thank you. Emma tends to get attached to small details." "I'd like to think small details matter," Alex countered gently. Maggie studied him for a moment, her green eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to gauge his sincerity. "Why don't we step outside? It's quieter, and Emma's with a neighbor for the afternoon." Alex followed her out to a small courtyard behind the clinic, where a bench sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree. Maggie motioned for him to sit, and for a few moments neither spoke. "I have to admit," Maggie began, breaking the silence, "I wasn't sure if you'd actually come here or if our paths at the gala were just a coincidence." "I don't believe in coincidences," Alex said, his tone steady. "And if there's even a chance that Emma's comment could mean something, I'd be a fool to ignore it." Her expression shifted, a flicker of unease passing over her features. "Emma has a vivid imagination. She likes to make connections where there aren't any." Alex leaned forward, his gaze intent but kind. "I don't think she imagined this. And I don't think you did either." Maggie met his eyes, her own filled with a mixture of defiance and vulnerability. "What are you hoping to find, Alex? Because if you're looking for some grand answer, you won't find it here." For a moment, Alex considered backing down. But then he thought of Isabel and the years he'd spent searching for closure. "I don't know what I'm hoping to find," he admitted. "But I do know that ring isn't just a coincidence. And I think you do too." Maggie looked away, her hands clasping the edge of the bench tightly. The air between them was thick with unspoken truths, the tension almost tangible. Finally, she exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left in the past, Alex. Trust me." But Alex couldn't. Not yet. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard where Alex and Maggie sat. The gentle rustling of the oak tree's leaves filled the silence between them. Maggie's words, "Some things are better left in the past," hung heavily in the air, challenging Alex in a way few things ever had. He studied her profile as she stared ahead, her gaze fixed on something distant and unseen. Maggie's auburn hair caught the sunlight in fiery streaks, but her posture, tense, arms crossed over her chest, betrayed a wariness that intrigued him. Alex knew this was not just about the ring. There was a deeper story here, one she wasn't ready to tell. "I can respect that," Alex said finally, his tone measured. "But I've learned that leaving things buried doesn't mean they disappear. It just means they find another way to haunt you." Maggie turned to him, her green eyes narrowing. "You think I don't know that?" she said, her voice sharper than he expected. "You don't get to waltz into my life, ask a few cryptic questions, and act like you understand." Alex straightened, the controlled calm he used in business negotiations wavering under the heat of her gaze. "I'm not trying to overstep," he said carefully. "But if there's something about that ring, about your connection to it, I need to know." Maggie stood abruptly, brushing invisible dust from her coat. She paced a few steps, then stopped, exhaling hard. "Do you even hear yourself? You need to know. Why? So you can satisfy some lingering curiosity? Or so you can check off another box in your perfectly curated life?" The accusation hit its mark, but Alex didn't flinch. Instead, he rose slowly, maintaining his composure. "That's not fair, Maggie," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "You don't know me. You don't know what this means to me." She turned to face him, her arms crossed defensively. "Then why don't you explain it, Alex? Why is this so important to you?" For a moment, Alex hesitated. The vulnerability required to answer that question wasn't something he often shared. But looking at Maggie, he saw someone who carried her own burdens, her own walls. If he wanted her to trust him, he had to take the first step. "This ring," he began, lifting his hand so the sapphire caught the light, "was my sister's. Isabel. She disappeared almost 20 years ago. No trace, no explanation, just gone." His voice softened, the weight of the memory pressing against his chest. "I gave it to her on her 16th birthday. It was supposed to be a promise." A bond. Maggie's posture shifted slightly, her arms uncrossing. Her expression was less guarded now, though still cautious. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been awful." "It was," Alex admitted, his throat tightening. "And when your daughter mentioned this ring, when I saw how similar yours was, it felt like the first real clue I've had in years. I don't want to disrupt your life, Maggie, but I can't ignore this." She looked at him for a long moment, the weight of his confession settling between them. Then, with a sigh, she sat back down on the bench. Alex followed suit, careful to give her space. "I didn't know Isabel," Maggie said finally, her voice subdued, "but someone I cared about did." Alex's pulse quickened, though he kept his expression neutral. "Who?" Maggie hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I met her when I was volunteering at a shelter in upstate New York. This was before Emma was born. Isabel wasn't her name then, but she talked about running away from her family, about needing to start over." Alex leaned in slightly, his heart pounding. "Did she say why?" "She didn't tell me much," Maggie said, her voice tinged with regret. "Just that it wasn't safe for her to go back, that she couldn't trust anyone." She glanced at him, her expression conflicted. "She was scared, Alex. Whatever happened to her, it left scars." The image of his sister, fearful, alone, cut through Alex like a blade. He'd always imagined Isabel as the fiery, independent girl who could light up a room with her laughter. The idea that she had been running for her life, too afraid to reach out, was almost too much to bear. "Why didn't you tell me this at the gala?" Alex asked, his voice low but steady. "Because I didn't think it mattered," Maggie admitted. "I didn't want to reopen wounds for either of us. And because I wasn't sure what you'd do with the information." Alex nodded slowly, understanding her caution but unwilling to let it deter him. "Do you know where she went after the shelter?" Maggie shook her head. "She didn't stay long, a few weeks maybe. Then she left without saying goodbye." She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands. "But she left something behind." Alex's breath caught. "What?" Maggie hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her coat. She pulled out a small envelope, yellowed with age. "She gave this to me before she left. Told me to keep it safe. I haven't opened it." Alex took the envelope with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the faded handwriting. It was Isabel's. There was no doubt in his mind. "Why didn't you—" Alex began, but Maggie cut him off. "Because I thought it wasn't my story to tell," she said firmly, "and because I didn't know if you deserved to read it." The words stung, but Alex knew they weren't without merit. For years he'd buried himself in his work, his wealth, and his carefully constructed life, avoiding the pain of Isabel's disappearance. Now he had to face it head-on. "Thank you," he said quietly, slipping the envelope into his pocket. "For keeping this. For trusting me with it." Maggie nodded, her expression softening. "Just be careful, Alex. Whatever you find, it might not be what you're hoping for." As Alex stood to leave, he glanced back at Maggie, her figure silhouetted against the golden light of the setting sun. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a resilience, that made him want to know more. But for now, his focus was on Isabel and the secrets waiting inside that envelope. Whatever lay ahead, Alex knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change forever. Alex paced the length of his penthouse living room, the envelope from Maggie resting on the marble coffee table like a talisman. The sprawling view of Manhattan's glittering skyline framed him, but tonight, the city's vibrant energy felt distant. His mind was consumed by the small, faded relic of his past. He hadn't opened it yet. The envelope contained answers, maybe even a piece of Isabel herself. Yet a part of him hesitated. What if it confirmed his worst fears? What if Isabel's words revealed a pain he could never undo? Jonas entered the room quietly, a tablet in hand, but Alex barely noticed. His assistant cleared his throat. "Alex, we've got updates on the Fairfield Clinic donation. Maggie Davis is set to attend the board meeting to finalize the details. Thought you'd want to know." Alex turned, his expression tight. "Is that all?" Jonas hesitated, then spoke carefully. "You seem unsettled. Is this about your sister?" Alex's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I met someone who might know more about Isabel than anyone I've talked to in years. She gave me this." He gestured to the envelope. "But opening it feels like stepping off a cliff." Jonas placed the tablet on the counter and regarded Alex with quiet understanding. "You've spent years trying to find Isabel. Whatever's in there, you owe it to yourself, and to her, to face it. You've never been the type to back away from a challenge." Alex managed a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "This is different, Jonas. This isn't a deal to close or a company to acquire. This is family." Jonas nodded, his voice gentle. "And that makes it worth the risk." Alex let the words linger as Jonas excused himself. Alone again, Alex finally reached for the envelope. He ran his thumb along its frayed edge before tearing it open with a quiet rip. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was unmistakable. Isabel's delicate script, looping and precise. His breath caught as he began to read. Dear Alex, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I'm writing it for myself as much as for you. Maybe it's my way of holding on to the brother I used to know, the one who made me laugh when things got hard and promised to protect me when life felt too heavy. I had to leave. I think you know why. Dad's temper wasn't just bruises and shouting. It was fear that I couldn't live with anymore. And I couldn't stay and watch it destroy you too. Running wasn't easy. I've had to start over again and again, always looking over my shoulder. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I've found something worth staying for. Her name is Emma. You'd love her, Alex. She's curious and fearless, and has the kind of laugh that makes the world seem brighter. She's my sunshine, even on the darkest days. I wish I could tell you more. I wish I could see you again. But every time I think about reaching out, the fear creeps back in. I wonder if I'm strong enough to face what I left behind. Please know that I think of you every day, that I miss you. Love always. Isabel. Alex lowered the letter, his hands trembling. Isabel had a daughter, Emma. The revelation struck him like a thunderclap, equal parts joy and anguish. She'd been alive, raising a child, living a life he'd never been a part of. And she'd carried the same fear, the same burden of their father's abuse, even after all these years. He folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Then, for the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. The next morning, Alex arrived at the Fairfield Clinic for the scheduled board meeting. He wasn't there for business, though. The generous donation was merely a pretense. Today, he was there for Maggie. She greeted him in the hallway outside the conference room, her white coat swapped for a crisp navy blouse and tailored slacks. She looked professional yet approachable, her auburn hair loose over her shoulders. Alex, she said, a note of surprise in her voice. You're early. I wanted to talk to you before the meeting, he replied, his tone steady but serious. It's important. Maggie's brow furrowed, but she nodded and gestured toward a quieter corner of the lobby. All right, what's on your mind? Alex took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. I opened the letter. Her expression shifted, a flicker of emotion crossing her face. And? It was from Isabel, Alex said. She mentioned Emma. Maggie's hands clasped tightly in front of her, but she didn't look away. I figured she would. Isabel was proud of Emma. She talked about her all the time. You knew, Alex said quietly, though there was no accusation in his voice. You knew Emma was Isabel's daughter. Maggie nodded, her eyes clouded with emotion. I didn't know at first. Isabel didn't share much about her past. But when Emma was born, the pieces started to fit. She never said it outright, but I could tell. Alex ran a hand through his hair, trying to process the information. Why didn't you tell me? Maggie's voice softened. Because she didn't want me to. Isabel was terrified of being found. She thought reaching out to you would put both of you in danger. I was trying to respect her wishes. Alex looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the guilt she carried for keeping the secret. I understand why you did it, Alex said after a moment. But I can't ignore this, Maggie. Isabel's out there somewhere, and Emma deserves to know her mother's story. She deserves to know her family. Maggie's expression softened, but her hesitation remained. What are you planning to do, Alex? I'm going to find Isabel, he said firmly. I'm not giving up on her, not again. Maggie held his gaze, a mixture of admiration and apprehension in her eyes. Then I hope you're ready, Alex. Because finding her won't just change your life, it'll change all of ours. As the weight of her words sank in, Alex knew she was right. But no matter the risks, He was ready to face whatever came next. For Isabel, for Emma, and perhaps for himself. The rhythmic hum of the engine filled the cabin as Alex's sleek black car sped down the quiet highway back toward Manhattan. His thoughts were a storm of emotions, hope, guilt, determination, all swirling around Isabel's letter and the truth about Emma. He clenched the steering wheel tighter as Maggie's words echoed in his mind. Finding her won't just change your life, it'll change all of ours. She was right, of course. If he found Isabel, he wouldn't just be reopening old wounds, he'd be shifting the lives of everyone connected to her. Yet the thought of letting this chance slip away felt unbearable. Isabel was his sister. Emma was his niece. They deserved to be part of his life, and he was determined to make it happen. That evening, Alex sat in his sprawling penthouse, staring at the photograph Jonas had managed to pull from Isabel's shelter records. It was old, grainy, and taken years ago, but it was unmistakably her. Isabel's features were softer, her hair darker, but the same sharp determination shone in her eyes. She had aged, yes, but she hadn't vanished entirely. Not yet. Jonas knocked lightly before stepping into the room. He placed a thick file on the desk in front of Alex. "This is everything we've found on Isabel so far," he said. "It's not much, but it's a start." Alex nodded, flipping through the pages. Each clue felt like a lifeline. Addresses where Isabel might have lived, people she may have worked with, and scattered mentions of her name. But as promising as it all seemed, there was one glaring truth. This wouldn't be easy. "Anything concrete?" Alex asked without looking up. "Not yet," Jonas admitted. "But there's a lead on a woman who knew Isabel at the shelter in New York. I reached out. She's willing to meet tomorrow." Alex leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "Good. Set it up." Jonas hesitated before speaking again. "This might sound forward, but are you sure you're ready for this? Finding Isabel won't erase the years she's been gone, and it won't answer every question." "I don't need every answer," Alex replied, his voice steady but laced with conviction. "I just need her back." Jonas nodded, his quiet loyalty evident. "Understood." The next morning, Alex was halfway through his espresso when his phone buzzed. The screen lit up with Maggie's name. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Maggie," he said, his tone warm but cautious. "Alex?" she replied, her voice softer than usual. I wanted to apologize for yesterday. I didn't mean to sound harsh, this is all so complicated." Alex set his cup down, leaning forward as he spoke. "You don't need to apologize. You were right. This will change everything. But Maggie, I can't let fear stop me. Not when it comes to Isabel." "I know," she said, a hint of resignation in her tone. "And maybe that's what scares me. She left for a reason, Alex. What if she doesn't want to be found?" The question hung in the air, heavier than either of them wanted to admit. "I have to take that chance," Alex said finally, "because not looking for her, that would be worse." There was a pause on the line, the silence stretching just long enough to make him wonder if she'd hung up. Then Maggie spoke again, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I don't think I've ever met anyone as stubborn as you," she said, a faint smile audible in her words. "But I get it. If it were Emma, I'd do the same." Her admission warmed something in him, the smallest crack in her carefully constructed walls. "I appreciate you saying that," Alex replied gently. "It means a lot." "And Alex," she added, her tone firmer now, "just be careful, okay? Isabel's story isn't just yours to tell." "I understand," he said, though he knew he'd have to prove that in time. Later that afternoon, Alex arrived at a small, tucked-away cafe in Brooklyn to meet the woman Jonas had found. The space was cozy but unassuming, with mismatched furniture and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee. The woman, Eleanor, was in her 60s, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup. Her eyes were sharp, though, betraying a keen awareness of her surroundings. She watched Alex approach with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Mr. Hart," she said as he sat across from her, "I wasn't expecting someone so polished." Alex smiled faintly. "I get that a lot." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for him to explain his presence. "I'm looking for my sister," Alex began, his tone direct but sincere. "Her name was Isabel. She lived at the shelter you worked at about 18 years ago." Eleanor studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "I remember Isabel," she said, her voice softening. "Quiet, smart, always helping the other women when she could." "Do you know where she went?" Alex asked, his hope rising. "She didn't talk much about her plans," Eleanor admitted. "But I know she was running from something, or someone. She was scared, but she didn't let it show. Said she couldn't afford to." Alex's chest tightened at the thought of Isabel living in fear for so many years. "Did she ever mention family? Me?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "Once. She said she had a brother, someone she missed terribly. But she didn't think you could save her. She said she had to save herself." The words hit Alex like a blow, leaving him momentarily breathless. Isabel hadn't reached out because she thought he couldn't help her. He'd failed her without even realizing it. "Do you have any idea where she might have gone?" Alex asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Eleanor studied him carefully before answering. "There was a man she trusted. A friend, I think. He ran an art gallery in a small town upstate. She said if things ever got too hard, she might go there." "What town?" Alex pressed. "Hudson Falls," Eleanor said. "It's quiet, out of the way. If she's anywhere, it's there." Alex nodded, his determination hardening into resolve. "Thank you, Eleanor. For everything." As he left the cafe, Alex felt a mix of hope and dread brewing inside him. Hudson Falls could be the key to finding Isabel, or another dead end. Either way, he was one step closer to the truth, and one step closer to finally bringing his sister home. Alex stood on the balcony of his penthouse that evening, staring out at the endless sprawl of lights below. Manhattan never truly slept, yet the world beyond the glass felt distant, untouchable. His mind was fixated on the name Eleanor had given him, Hudson Falls. A quiet town, far from the relentless pace of the city, where Isabel might have sought refuge. He should have felt closer to her, knowing there was a real place to search. Instead, he was haunted by Eleanor's words. She said she had to save herself. Isabel had doubted his ability to help her, and the realization gnawed at him. If only he'd been older, stronger, braver, maybe things would have been different. The buzz of his phone snapped him from his thoughts. Maggie's name lit up the screen. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Alex," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding Isabel." "And?" he prompted, trying to keep the hope from creeping into his tone. "I want to help," Maggie said after a pause. "I've been holding back because, well, it's complicated. But if you're going to Hudson Falls, you shouldn't go alone." Alex leaned against the railing, the cool breeze brushing against his face. "You don't owe me this, Maggie." "No," she replied, her voice steady. "But I owe it to Isabel. She trusted me once. I don't know if I deserve it, but I want to do right by her." Her words carried a sincerity that disarmed him. "Are you sure? This won't be easy." "Neither was keeping her secret all these years," Maggie admitted. "But I think it's time." The following morning, Alex and Maggie drove out of the city, the skyscrapers giving way to sprawling countryside. The tension in the car was palpable, an unspoken understanding hanging between them. Maggie glanced out the window, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her sweater. "You're quiet," Alex said, breaking the silence. "Just thinking," she replied, turning to him. "About Isabel. About what happens if we find her." "What are you afraid of?" he asked gently. Maggie hesitated. "That she won't want to be found. Isabel had this way of shutting people out when she was scared. She didn't just build walls, she fortified them." Alex nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "I know, but walls aren't impenetrable, not if you care enough to break them down." Maggie smiled faintly, though her eyes were filled with doubt. "I hope you're right." They drove the rest of the way in silence, the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees their only soundtrack. Hudson Falls emerged as they rounded a bend, its quiet charm instantly apparent. It was the kind of town where time seemed to slow, where neighbors waved to each other and children played in tree-lined streets. Alex parked near the town square, his gaze sweeping over the modest buildings and colorful storefronts. It was a far cry from the towering steel and glass of his world, yet there was something grounding about it. "Where do we start?" Maggie asked, stepping out of the car and pulling her coat tighter against the cool breeze. Alex pointed toward a small art gallery at the corner of the square. "There. Eleanor mentioned an old friend of Isabel's worked here." The gallery was unassuming, its large windows displaying a collection of local landscapes and abstract pieces. Inside, the air was warm and faintly tinged with the scent of linseed oil. A man in his 60s, with a kind face and an apron streaked with paint, looked up from a canvas as they entered. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of someone who had spent his life in quiet spaces. Alex stepped forward, his posture respectful but purposeful. "I'm looking for someone who might have worked with you years ago. Isabel Hart." The man's expression froze for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he studied Alex's face. Then recognition dawned, and he set his brush down slowly. "You're her brother." It wasn't a question but a statement, as if the resemblance was unmistakable. Alex nodded, his throat tight. "Yes." The man sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Isabel spoke about you sometimes. Said you were driven, stubborn. Guess she was right." His tone was warm, but there was a guarded edge to it. "Do you know where she is?" Alex asked, his voice tinged with urgency. The man, whose name tag read Thomas, hesitated. "She worked here for a while, but she moved on. Said she needed to keep moving, to stay under the radar." "Why?" Maggie asked, stepping closer. "What was she afraid of?" Thomas glanced between them, his brow furrowed. "She never said much, but I got the sense she was running from something, or someone. She didn't trust easily, but she was kind. Talented, too. She could paint like you wouldn't believe." Alex felt a pang of sadness at the image of Isabel creating art while carrying the weight of her fear. "Do you have any idea where she went?" Thomas studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "She mentioned a place upstate, a cabin in the woods. Said it was the only place she ever felt safe." "Do you know where it is?" Alex pressed. Thomas nodded slowly. "I can draw you a map. But Alex, if she didn't want to be found—" "She's my sister," Alex interrupted, his voice firm. "I have to try." Thomas nodded, his expression softening. "I hope you find her then. She deserves peace." As they left the gallery, Alex felt a renewed sense of purpose. Maggie walked beside him, her expression thoughtful. "Are you ready for this?" she asked quietly. "I've never been more ready for anything," Alex replied, determination etched into his every word. The map in his hand felt like a lifeline, pulling him closer to Isabel with every step. Whatever awaited him in those woods, Alex was ready to face it, for her, for Emma, and for the chance to finally make things right. The narrow road leading to the cabin wound through dense woods, the towering pines casting long shadows in the fading light of the afternoon. The hum of Alex's car engine was the only sound, a steady reminder of the journey's weight. Maggie sat beside him, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze fixed on the map Thomas had drawn. "Turn left up ahead," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "It should be just beyond that ridge." Alex nodded, his jaw set with determination. The closer they got, the more he felt the weight of years pressing down on him. He had spent so long imagining this moment, wondering if it would ever come. Now, with every mile, the reality of facing Isabel again became sharper, more vivid. "I can feel your tension from over here," Maggie said, offering a faint smile. "You've barely said a word since we left Hudson Falls." Alex glanced at her briefly, his lips curving into a fleeting smile. "I'm just thinking." "About what?" He hesitated, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "About what I'm going to say to her, about whether she'll even want to see me." Maggie sighed, her fingers brushing over the map. "She will, Alex. Whatever fears she had, you're still her brother. That connection doesn't just disappear." "I hope you're right," he murmured, though doubt lingered in his eyes. They crested the ridge, and Maggie pointed to a small, overgrown path veering off the road. "There, that should lead us to the cabin." Alex turned onto the narrow path, the car's tires crunching against the gravel. The trees seemed to close in around them, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, more still, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When they finally reached the clearing, the cabin came into view. It was small and weathered, its wooden exterior faded with time. A stack of firewood leaned against the side, and a thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, signaling that someone was home. Alex killed the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. He sat there for a moment, staring at the cabin as his heart pounded in his chest. Maggie reached over, her hand brushing against his arm. "You can do this," she said softly. "She needs to see you, even if she doesn't know it yet." He turned to her, his gratitude evident. "Thank you, Maggie, for everything." She smiled, her warmth cutting through his tension. "Let's go." The crunch of their footsteps on the gravel echoed in the quiet as they approached the cabin. Alex's throat tightened with every step, the reality of the moment sinking in. He raised his hand to knock, hesitating for the briefest moment before rapping his knuckles against the weathered wood. The sound seemed to reverberate through the stillness, and Alex held his breath, his heart thundering in his chest. A few moments passed, then the door creaked open. Standing there was a woman Alex would have recognized anywhere, despite the years that had passed. Isabel's hair was streaked with gray, her features softer and more worn, but her eyes, the same piercing blue as his, were unmistakable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Isabel stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Alex?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's really me." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes as she stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his face. "I thought I'd lost you," she murmured, her voice breaking. "You didn't," Alex said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I've been looking for you, Isabel, all this time." Isabel let out a choked sob, pulling him into a tight embrace. Alex held her close, his own tears falling freely as years of pain and longing melted away in that single moment. Maggie stood back, giving them space, her own eyes misting at the sight of their reunion. When Isabel finally pulled back, she noticed Maggie for the first time, her brows furrowing in confusion. "Maggie?" she asked, her voice laced with surprise. Maggie stepped forward, her smile gentle. "Hi, Isabel. It's been a long time." Isabel shook her head, her emotions swirling. "I don't understand. How did you find me? Why are you here?" Alex reached into his pocket, pulling out the letter. "This," he said simply, holding it out to her. "Maggie gave it to me." Isabel's hand trembled as she took the letter, her expression shifting to one of guilt. "I wrote this so many years ago. I never thought you'd actually see it." "I'm glad I did," Alex said, his voice firm. "It brought me here." Isabel looked between them, her eyes filling with questions. "Why now? Why after all this time?" "Because you're my sister," Alex said, his voice unwavering, "and I'm not letting fear keep us apart anymore." Isabel's shoulders sagged, the weight of years of running and hiding finally catching up to her. "I don't know if I can do this, Alex. I've built a life here, a quiet one. I don't know if I'm ready to face everything I left behind." Alex stepped closer, his expression earnest. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here. Maggie's here. And there's someone else who deserves to know you." Isabel's breath hitched. "Emma?" Alex nodded, his voice softening. "She's incredible, Isabel. You'd be so proud of her." Tears spilled down Isabel's cheeks as she pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome with emotion. "I've missed so much." "You don't have to miss any more," Alex said. "Come home, Isabel. Let's figure this out together." Isabel hesitated, the fear in her eyes warring with the longing in her heart. Maggie stepped forward, her voice steady and reassuring. "We'll take it one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations. Just family." Isabel looked at both of them, the walls she had built over the years beginning to crack. Slowly, she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Okay," she said. "Let's start with one step." Alex smiled, relief and hope flooding through him. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, the future felt within reach. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the thin curtains of Isabel's small cabin, casting soft rays over the modest living room. The atmosphere inside was quiet yet charged, like the calm after a storm. Alex sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, his thoughts heavy as he watched Isabel move about the room. She had always been quick, graceful, even in the small, unassuming movements of brewing tea or tidying up. Yet now there was a tension to her, an unease that told Alex she was still grappling with his sudden reappearance in her life. Maggie joined him at the table, her expression calm but watchful. She gave him a slight nod, a silent gesture of reassurance. They had done what seemed impossible, found Isabel and begun the fragile work of reconnecting. But Alex knew the road ahead would be far from smooth. "Isabel," he began carefully, his voice cutting through the stillness. "About Emma." "I don't want to talk about her," Isabel interrupted, her back to him as she poured hot water into a teapot. Her shoulders stiffened, and Alex could see the strain in every line of her body. "She's your daughter," Alex pressed gently. "Don't you want to—" "I said I don't want to talk about her," Isabel snapped, turning to face him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and pain. "You don't understand, Alex. You can't just waltz in here after 20 years and expect me to—" "To what?" Alex interrupted, his tone soft but insistent. "Expect you to be ready for this? Isabel, I've spent years looking for you. I've turned over every stone, followed every lead, because I couldn't accept that you were just gone. And now that I've found you, I can't ignore the fact that Emma exists. She's part of this family." Isabel flinched as if the word family was a dagger. "You think this is simple? That I can just walk back into her life and pretend I'm someone I'm not? I gave her up for a reason, Alex." Maggie, who had been silent until now, placed a gentle hand on Isabel's arm. "Isabel," she said softly, "no one's asking you to have all the answers right now. But Alex is right. Emma deserves to know the truth, even if it takes time." Isabel shook her head, tears spilling over as she pulled away from Maggie's touch. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I don't know how to face her. I don't know if I can." Alex's heart ached at the vulnerability in his sister's voice. He stood, crossing the room to stand beside her. "You don't have to do it alone," he said, his voice steady. "We'll take this one step at a time. Together." For a long moment, Isabel didn't respond. She stared at the floor, her hands clenched at her sides, before finally exhaling a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can be the mother she needs," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to be perfect," Maggie said gently, stepping closer. "You just have to try." Later that day, Alex and Maggie walked through the woods surrounding the cabin, the crisp autumn air carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Isabel had asked for time alone to process everything, and Alex respected her need for space, though it left him restless. "She's scared," Maggie said after a while, breaking the silence. She tucked her hands into the pockets of her coat, her breath visible in the cool air. "And she's been running for so long it's hard for her to stop." "I know," Alex replied, his voice tinged with frustration. "But I can't just sit back and do nothing. She's my sister Maggie. And Emma. She's part of this family too." Maggie stopped walking, turning to face him. "You don't have to convince me, Alex. I'm on your side. But you need to remember that Isabel's been through things you can't begin to imagine. Pushing too hard, too fast. It'll only make her retreat." Alex sighed, raking a hand through his hair. "I know you're right. I just don't want her to slip away again." "She won't," Maggie said firmly, her gaze steady. "Not with you here. Not with both of us here." There was a warmth in her words, a quiet reassurance that steadied Alex in a way he hadn't expected. He looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Trust, connection, maybe even the beginnings of something more. "Thank you," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now. "For being here, for helping me through this." Maggie smiled, her expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Alex. I'm here because I care. About Isabel, about Emma, and about you." The weight of her words hung in the air, a delicate thread connecting them. Alex felt his heart quicken, a warmth spreading through him despite the coolness of the day. "Maggie," he began, but before he could say more, she placed a hand on his arm. "Let's take it one step at a time," she said, echoing the words she had offered Isabel. Her eyes held a mixture of understanding and patience, and Alex nodded, knowing she was right. When they returned to the cabin, Isabel was sitting on the porch, her expression unreadable. She looked up as they approached, her gaze lingering on Alex. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "About Emma, about everything." Alex stopped at the foot of the steps, his heart pounding. "And?" Isabel hesitated, then stood, crossing her arms over her chest. "If we do this, if I try to see her, I'm going to need your help. Both of you." Alex felt a surge of relief and hope. He stepped closer, his voice resolute. "You have it. Always." Isabel looked at him, her walls still partially intact but beginning to crumble. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's take that first step." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough. For now, it was enough. The sound of tires crunching over gravel echoed through the quiet, as Alex's car pulled into the driveway of Maggie's modest home the following evening. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and lavender, a picturesque calm that belied the tension in his chest. In the back seat, Isabel fidgeted with the hem of her jacket, her fingers twitching with nervous energy. She hadn't spoken much during the drive, her focus shifting between the passing scenery and her own swirling thoughts. "She's excited to see you," Maggie said, glancing at Isabel in the rearview mirror. Her voice was soft, meant to reassure, but Isabel didn't look convinced. "Excited might change to confused," Isabel replied, her words barely above a whisper. Or worse. Alex, seated in the driver's seat, turned slightly, his gaze meeting hers. "You're her mother, Isabel. She'll feel that, even if it takes time." Isabel offered a tight smile, but her eyes betrayed her uncertainty. "I hope you're right." The car came to a stop, and Maggie stepped out first, her confident movements a stark contrast to Isabel's hesitation. Alex followed, opening the back door and extending a hand toward his sister. Isabel stared at it for a moment before taking it, her grip cool but firm. "Let's go," Alex said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "We're in this together." The interior of Maggie's home was warm and welcoming, the kind of space that instantly put people at ease. A faint scent of cinnamon lingered in the air, mingling with the soft hum of a song playing from a small speaker on the counter. Isabel stood just inside the doorway, her hands clasped tightly, as if holding herself together. "Emma's upstairs," Maggie said, her tone gentle. "I'll go get her." Alex watched as Maggie ascended the staircase, her movements purposeful yet unhurried. He glanced at Isabel, who seemed frozen in place, her gaze darting around the room as though searching for an escape. "You're going to be fine," Alex said, stepping closer to her. "She's a kid, Isabel. She's not expecting perfection, just honesty." Isabel gave a shaky nod, her lips parting as if to respond, but before she could, a flurry of footsteps sounded from above. Seconds later, Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, her teddy bear tucked under one arm, her face alight with curiosity. "Is she here?" Emma called out, her wide hazel eyes scanning the room. Maggie appeared behind her, her hands gently resting on her daughter's shoulders. "She's here," Maggie said softly, giving Emma an encouraging nod. "Go say hello." Emma hesitated for a moment, her gaze landing on Isabel. Alex could see the wheels turning in her young mind, processing the unfamiliar face, searching for something familiar. Then, with a tentative smile, Emma descended the stairs, each step careful and deliberate. "Hi," she said, stopping a few feet from Isabel. Her voice was small, tinged with a mixture of shyness and curiosity. Isabel crouched to meet Emma's gaze, her movements slow and deliberate. "Hi," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "You must be Emma." Emma nodded, hugging her teddy bear closer. "That's me. And you're—" Isabel hesitated, glancing at Alex for reassurance. He gave her a small nod and she turned back to Emma, her expression softening. "I'm Isabel," she said finally. "Your mom and we used to know each other, a long time ago." Emma tilted her head, her brow furrowing in thought. "You're the one who gave her the ring, aren't you?" Isabel's eyes widened, and she glanced at Maggie, who stood near the stairs, her expression unreadable. "She told you about that?" Isabel asked. "Uh-huh," Emma said, her tone brightening. "She said it was special, like magic." Isabel let out a breathy laugh, her lips curving into a small smile. "It is special. It belonged to someone very important to me." Emma's gaze dropped to Isabel's hands, where her fingers nervously twisted together. "Do you have one too?" Isabel stilled, the question catching her off guard. "I don't," she admitted, her voice soft. "But I think—" Maybe we could share the magic from your mom's ring, if that's okay with you." Emma considered this for a moment, then stepped forward, holding out her teddy bear. "You can hold this if you want. He's pretty good at sharing magic, too." Tears welled in Isabel's eyes as she accepted the bear, cradling it carefully. "Thank you, Emma," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot to me." From his spot by the doorway, Alex felt a lump rise in his throat. The scene before him was tentative and raw, but it was also the first step toward something greater. A bridge was being built, fragile but full of promise. As the evening unfolded, the tension in the room began to ease. Emma's natural curiosity and bright energy pulled Isabel out of her shell, their conversations growing warmer with each passing minute. Maggie stayed close, offering quiet support, while Alex watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with hope. Later, as Emma yawned and rubbed her eyes, Maggie guided her toward the stairs. "Time for bed, kiddo," she said, her tone gentle but firm. Emma pouted but obeyed, pausing to look back at Isabel. "Will you be here tomorrow?" she asked. Isabel hesitated, then nodded. "I will." Satisfied, Emma smiled and bounded up the stairs, her teddy bear tucked securely under her arm. When the room fell silent, Isabel sank into the couch, her shoulders sagging with relief. "I didn't think I'd make it through that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex sat beside her, his expression warm. "You did more than just make it through. You connected with her. That's what matters." Maggie joined them, sitting across from Isabel. "You were great," she said sincerely. "Emma already adores you." Isabel let out a soft laugh, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, either of you." "You don't have to," Alex said, his voice firm. "We're family, Isabel, and we're not letting you go again." Isabel nodded, her expression softening. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future, one filled with connection, love, and hope. It wasn't perfect. It wouldn't be easy, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The next morning brought a pale winter sun that filtered through the curtains in Maggie's living room, casting soft golden light over the quiet space. Alex sat at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, staring out the window at the frost-covered lawn. Isabel had left early, retreating to her cabin with a quiet promise to return the next day. It was progress, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling of fragility that hung in the air. Every step forward seemed balanced on the edge of a knife. Maggie moved around the kitchen, her movements practiced as she prepared breakfast for Emma. She seemed calmer this morning, though there was a tension in her shoulders that Alex couldn't ignore. He had come to recognize it over the past few days, a defensive posture that hinted at her struggle to manage the emotions swirling within her. "She's doing better than I expected," Alex said, breaking the silence. Maggie glanced over her shoulder, her expression thoughtful. "She is, but don't mistake progress for peace. Isabel's still carrying a lot. It's going to take time." "I know," Alex replied, his voice steady. "But she's here, Maggie, that's what matters." Maggie nodded, but her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's a start," she said, turning back to the stovetop. "But I worry about Emma." Alex frowned. "What do you mean?" "She's a kid, Alex. She's resilient, but she's also impressionable. Isabel showing up like this, it's going to change everything for her. I just don't want her to get hurt." "She won't," Alex said firmly. "Isabel's trying, Maggie. She wouldn't be here if she wasn't ready to make this work." Maggie turned to face him, crossing her arms over her chest. "And what if she's not? What if she realizes it's too much and pulls away again? What then, Alex?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and challenging. Alex exhaled, setting his coffee down with a soft clink. "Then we'll deal with it. Together. You don't have to do this alone." Maggie's eyes softened, her defenses faltering for a moment. You make it sound so simple. It's not, Alex admitted, his voice low but resolute. But family isn't supposed to be easy, Maggie. It's supposed to be worth it. Later that afternoon, Alex found himself back in the city, seated in the corner of a private cafe near his office. He had agreed to meet Victoria, his business partner, to discuss a merger deal that had been stalled for weeks. But the moment he arrived, she could tell his mind was elsewhere. You're distracted, Victoria said, sipping her espresso. Her sharp green eyes studied him with practiced precision. That's not like you. Alex leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You're not wrong. Care to share? She asked, arching an elegant brow. Or is this one of those rare moments when Alex's heart keeps his cards close to the chest? Alex hesitated, then decided there was no harm in telling her the truth, at least part of it. I've been dealing with some personal matters, family-related. Victoria's expression shifted slightly, her curiosity piqued. Family, that's new. You've always kept that part of your life under lock and key. Because it wasn't much of a life to share, Alex said, his tone even but edged with vulnerability. But things have changed. My sister, Isabel, I found her, after nearly 20 years. Victoria set her cup down, her expression softening in genuine surprise. That's incredible, Alex. I didn't even know you were looking for her. Not many people did, he admitted. But it's complicated. She's been through a lot and she's trying to rebuild. I'm just trying to figure out how to help her without pushing too hard. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. Family dynamics are messy, especially when there's history involved. But if anyone can handle it, it's you. You're nothing if not persistent. Alex chuckled, though the sound was tinged with self-awareness. Persistence has its limits. Sometimes it feels like every step forward brings another wall to climb. Then climb it, Victoria said simply. You've built empires, Alex. Don't tell me you're going to let a little emotional complexity stop you. Alex smiled, her bluntness a welcome reprieve from his swirling doubts. You're right, I won't. That evening, back at Maggie's house, Alex joined her on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of deep orange and pink. The air was cold, their breath visible in the fading light. They stood in companionable silence for a while, the quiet broken only by the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. You've been good with Emma, Maggie said finally, her voice carrying an undercurrent of gratitude. She adores you. She's an amazing kid, Alex replied, his tone warm, and she's lucky to have you. Maggie glanced at him, her eyes searching his face. You're not what I expected, you know. Alex turned to her, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? When we met, I thought you were just another wealthy guy who couldn't see beyond his own privilege, she admitted, her tone candid but not unkind. But you've surprised me, Alex. You care about people, about family. Her words struck something deep within him, a mix of gratitude and self-awareness. I didn't always, he said quietly. I spent a long time building walls, focusing on the next deal, the next achievement, because it was easier than facing what I'd lost. But finding Isabel, it's changed everything. Maggie nodded, her expression softening. She's lucky to have you fighting for her. And what about you? Alex asked, his voice quieter now. Are you lucky to have me fighting for this? Maggie's breath hitched slightly, her gaze locking with his. The weight of his question hung between them, charged with an emotion neither of them had spoken aloud. I think, she said slowly, that we're both still figuring out what this is. But yes, Alex, I'm glad you're here. A small smile curved his lips, warmth spreading through him despite the cold. Me too. For the first time in years, Alex felt a flicker of hope, Not just for Isabel or Emma, but for himself. Whatever came next, he wasn't facing it alone, and that made all the difference. The air was crisp and quiet as Alex parked his car outside Isabel's cabin the following morning. The frost on the ground sparkled under the rising sun, a fragile beauty that mirrored the delicate progress they'd made with Isabel. He tightened his scarf against the chill and made his way up the porch steps, his footsteps crunching softly on the wooden planks. When Isabel opened the door, she looked more rested than he'd seen her in days, but the wariness in her eyes lingered. "You're early," she said, her voice edged with a mixture of surprise and humor. "Wanted to catch you before you changed your mind," Alex replied, smiling faintly. "You ready?" Isabel hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the small, worn interior of the cabin. "As ready as I'll ever be, I guess." Alex waited patiently as Isabel grabbed her coat and stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind her. She crossed her arms, more for comfort than warmth, and followed Alex to the car. He opened the passenger door for her, his movements unhurried. "I can drive myself, you know," she said, her tone lightly teasing. "Humor me," Alex replied. "This way, you can't back out halfway." A small laugh escaped her, a sound Alex realized he hadn't heard in years. It was faint and fleeting, but it filled him with a sense of cautious optimism. The drive back to Maggie's house was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Isabel stared out the window, her fingers absently tracing the cracked leather strap of her bag. Alex wanted to say something, anything to ease the tension, but he knew Isabel needed the silence to steel herself. When they arrived, Maggie greeted them at the door with her usual calm warmth. Emma was sitting cross-legged on the floor in the living room, surrounded by a chaotic collection of crayons and paper. She looked up when Isabel walked in, her face lighting up with unfiltered excitement. "You came back!" Emma exclaimed, scrambling to her feet. Isabel managed a small smile, though Alex could see the effort it took. "I did," she said, her voice soft. Emma grabbed a piece of paper from the floor and held it out. "I made this for you. It's me and you and Mom and Alex. See?" Isabel took the drawing, her hands trembling slightly as she studied the crude but heartfelt depiction of their newfound family. She blinked rapidly, clearly fighting back tears. "It's beautiful, Emma." "Thank you." Emma beamed, oblivious to the emotional weight of the moment. "Want to color with me?" Isabel hesitated, then glanced at Maggie, who gave her an encouraging nod. "Sure," Isabel said, lowering herself to the floor with an awkward grace. As Emma began chattering excitedly about her drawings, Alex and Maggie stepped into the kitchen, giving them space. Alex leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, watching the scene through the doorway. "She's trying," Maggie said quietly, her tone tinged with admiration. "That's more than I expected this soon." "She's stronger than she gives herself credit for," Alex replied, "but I don't think she believes that yet." Maggie turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "She will. You've given her something she hasn't had in years. Hope." Alex looked at Maggie, his gaze lingering for a moment too long. "You've done the same for me," he said, his voice low and earnest. Maggie's breath caught, her cheeks flushing slightly. She started to respond, but before she could, a sharp cry from the living room shattered the moment. They rushed into the room to find Emma sitting on the floor, her face scrunched in confusion, while Isabel stood frozen, clutching the drawing Emma had given her. "Why are you mad?" Emma asked, her voice small. "I'm not mad," Isabel said quickly, though her trembling hands told a different story. I need some air." Before anyone could stop her, Isabel bolted for the door, leaving Alex and Maggie to exchange worried glances. Alex followed without hesitation, stepping out onto the porch to find Isabel pacing, her breath visible in the cold air. "What happened?" Alex asked, his tone gentle but firm. Isabel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this, Alex. It's too much." She looks at me like I'm this person I'm not, like I'm someone who deserves to be part of her life. "You are that person," Alex said, stepping closer. "She doesn't care about the mistakes or the time you've been apart. She just wants to know you." Isabel stopped pacing, her arms wrapping around herself protectively. "You don't understand. I can't live up to what she needs me to be. I've spent so many years running, hiding. What kind of example is that for a kid?" "The kind that shows her people can change," Alex said. "That they can face their fears and come out stronger on the other side." Isabel looked at him, her tear-streaked face filled with doubt. "And what if I fail?" Alex's voice softened, his eyes unwavering. "Then you get back up. Because that's what family does. They keep showing up, even when it's hard." Isabel exhaled shakily, the fight in her slowly giving way to something else, something fragile but hopeful. "I'm scared, Alex," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," he said, "but you're not alone anymore." For a moment they stood in silence, the chill of the air forgotten in the weight of the moment. Then, with a hesitant nod, Isabel wiped her tears and turned back toward the house. "I'll try," she said, her voice steadier now. "I can't promise anything, but I'll try." "That's all anyone can ask," Alex replied, his heart swelling with pride and relief. As Isabel stepped inside, Alex lingered on the porch for a moment, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but for the first time in years, he felt certain they were on the right path. And that, he thought, was a victory worth savoring. The soft glow of the fireplace cast flickering shadows across Maggie's living room as Alex leaned against the mantel, his thoughts restless despite the late hour. The day had been a fragile success. Isabel had stayed, coloring with Emma and even sharing a few cautious smiles. But Alex couldn't shake the undercurrent of tension that lingered in Isabel's every move, a tension that hinted at something deeper. Maggie entered the room quietly, her hands wrapped around 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to Alex and sat on the couch, tucking her legs beneath her. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," she said softly, watching him over the rim of her mug. Alex took a sip of his coffee, the warmth soothing but not enough to ease the knot in his chest. "It feels like I am," he admitted. "Every step forward with Isabel feels like it could fall apart at any second." Maggie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "She's been through a lot, Alex. More than either of us can probably imagine. But she stayed today. That's progress." "It is," Alex agreed, though his voice carried a hint of frustration. "But I can't help feeling like she's holding back. Like there's something she's not telling us." Maggie hesitated, her gaze dropping to her mug. "She might be, but forcing her to open up could push her further away." Alex turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "So what do I do? Just sit back and hope she decides to trust me one day?" "No," Maggie said, meeting his eyes. "You keep showing her that you're here, no matter what, that you're not going to walk away." Alex sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's hard, Maggie. I've spent years trying to find her, trying to fix the mistakes I made. And now that she's here, I feel like I'm still failing her." Maggie set her mug down and stood, crossing the room to stand in front of him. "You're not failing her, Alex. You're doing everything you can. And that's more than most people would." The sincerity in her voice hit him hard, and for a moment Alex felt the weight of her words. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and the warmth of her touch sent a ripple of something deeper through him. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice laced with gratitude. "I don't think I could do this without you." Maggie smiled, though her eyes held a vulnerability that mirrored his own. "You don't have to." The next day, Alex decided to take Isabel for a walk, hoping the quiet solitude of the woods might help her open up. The crisp winter air bit at their cheeks as they followed a narrow trail, their breath visible in the cold. For a while they walked in silence, the crunch of their boots against the frozen ground the only sound. "Do you remember when we were kids?" Alex asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. "How we used to sneak out of the house and play in the woods behind Grandma's farm." A faint smile tugged at Isabel's lips. "I remember. You always insisted on building those ridiculous forts that would collapse after an hour." Alex chuckled, the memory warming something inside him. "And you always pretended to be the queen, ordering me around." "Well, someone had to keep you in line," Isabel said, a touch of humor in her voice. The smile lingered for a moment before fading, her expression growing distant. "Those were simpler times." "They were," Alex agreed, "but they weren't perfect, and neither were we." Isabel stopped walking, turning to face him. "Why are you bringing this up, Alex?" "Because I want you to see that it's okay not to have everything figured out," he said. "You don't have to have all the answers, Isabel. You just have to try." Isabel's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her walls cracking under the weight of his words. "You don't know how hard it's been," she said, her voice trembling. "Running, hiding, never feeling safe. It changes you, Alex. It makes you question everything, even yourself." Alex stepped closer, his voice steady. "I can't change what happened to us, Isabel. But I can be here for you now. You don't have to do this alone anymore." For a moment, Isabel looked at him, the conflict in her eyes warring with the flicker of hope he had seen the day before. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe that." "Then let me prove it to you," Alex said, his tone resolute, "one step at a time." Back at Maggie's house, the air was warmer, filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies that Emma had insisted on making. Isabel watched from the kitchen table as Emma darted around, chattering excitedly about her latest creation. There was a lightness to the moment, a glimpse of the joy Alex had been hoping to see. "Mom, taste this," Emma called, holding out a cookie to Maggie. Maggie laughed, taking a bite and nodding in approval. "Perfect as always." Emma beamed, then turned to Isabel, her eyes bright with excitement. "What about you, Isabel? Do you want one?" Isabel hesitated, the word mom hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. She smiled faintly, taking the cookie Emma offered. "Thank you," she said softly. Alex watched the exchange, his chest tightening with emotion. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was a step, a small, tentative step towards something they all wanted, even if they were too afraid to admit it. As the evening wore on and the house grew quiet, Alex found himself standing on the porch again, staring out at the darkened woods. Maggie joined him, her presence a quiet comfort. "You're thinking too much again," she said, her voice teasing but kind. "Hard not to," Alex replied, his lips curving into a small smile. "There's a lot riding on this." Maggie leaned against the railing, her gaze steady. "You've done more for Isabel in the past few days than most people would do in a lifetime. Give yourself some credit." "I will," Alex said, turning to face her. "As long as you keep reminding me." Maggie's laughter was soft and warm, filling the cold night air. And in that moment, Alex felt something shift, something small but undeniable. Amid the chaos of rebuilding his family, something new was taking root. And for the first time in years, Alex allowed himself to hope that it might just be the beginning of something more. The morning dawned colder than usual, frost painting the windows of Maggie's house in delicate, crystalline patterns. Inside, the warmth of the living room was deceptive, masking the growing tension that simmered between Alex, Isabel, and Maggie. Isabel sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring her coffee. The smile she'd worn for Emma the day before had faded, replaced by a haunted look that Alex was beginning to recognize as her default defense. Maggie stood at the counter, flipping through the mail, her posture unusually stiff. Alex, leaning against the doorway, observed them both, a heavy sense of unease settling over him. The peace they'd managed to forge over the past few days felt tenuous, as if one wrong word might unravel everything. "So," Maggie began, breaking the silence, her tone light but forced. "What's the plan for today?" Emma burst into the room before anyone could respond, her boundless energy cutting through the tension. "Can we go to the park?" she asked, bouncing on her toes. "Isabel, you could come too. There's this big slide, and it's so fun." Isabel's grip on her mug tightened, her knuckles turning white. I don't know, Emma. Maybe another time." Emma's face fell, her excitement dimming. "But why not? It'll be fun, please." "Emma," Maggie interjected gently, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Isabel might not feel like it today." Emma pouted but nodded, her disappointment evident. "Okay," she mumbled, turning back toward the living room. As soon as Emma was out of earshot, Isabel stood abruptly, setting her mug down with a force that made Alex wince. "I can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't pretend everything is fine when it's not." "Isabel," Alex said, stepping forward, "no one's asking you to pretend. We're just trying to give you space to—" "To what?" Isabel snapped, turning to face him. "To fail?" "Because that's what's going to happen, Alex. I'm going to fail, and Emma's the one who's going to get hurt." Maggie stepped in, her tone firm but calm. "You're not giving yourself enough credit, Isabel. Emma doesn't need you to be perfect. She just needs you to be here." "That's easy for you to say," Isabel shot back, her voice rising. "You've been here. You've raised her. You're the one she looks up to, not me." "She can look up to both of us," Maggie said, her voice softening. "If you let her." Isabel let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You don't get it. I've spent years running, hiding, convincing myself I didn't deserve anything more than the scraps of a life I built for myself. And now you're telling me to just step into this ready-made family and be okay with it? I can't." Alex's chest tightened at her words. "No one expects you to have it all figured out, Isabel. But walking away now isn't the answer." Isabel's eyes locked with his, the pain and anger in her gaze cutting through him. "And what happens when I mess up, Alex? When I say or do the wrong thing and Emma realizes I'm not the person she thinks I am? What then?" "You fix it," Alex said, his voice firm. "You show her that mistakes don't define you. That trying, even when it's hard, is what matters." Isabel's expression faltered, a crack in the armor she'd built so carefully. For a moment, Alex thought she might relent, but instead she turned away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I need some air," she muttered, grabbing her coat and heading for the door before anyone could stop her. The air outside was biting, stinging Isabel's cheeks as she stepped onto the porch. She leaned against the railing, her breath coming in uneven bursts, the weight of the conversation still pressing down on her. Behind her, the door opened and Alex stepped out, his footsteps careful as he approached. "Isabel," he said softly, stopping a few feet away. "I'm not going to pretend I understand everything you've been through. But I know what it feels like to carry guilt, to think you've failed the people who matter most." She turned to face him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "How did you get past it?" Alex hesitated, his gaze steady but filled with a vulnerability he rarely let show. "I didn't. Not entirely. But finding you, knowing you're alive, that there's still a chance to rebuild, helps. And now, seeing you with Emma, seeing the way she looks at you, It reminds me that it's not too late." Isabel shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "It feels too late, Alex. Like I've missed my chance." "It's not," he said firmly, stepping closer. "You have today. You have tomorrow. And you have us. That's more than enough to start." For a moment, Isabel didn't respond, her shoulders shaking as she tried to hold herself together. Alex reached out, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice low. "Whatever it takes, we'll figure it out. Together." Isabel let out a shaky breath, the tears finally spilling over. "I want to believe that." "Then start small," Alex said, his tone gentle but resolute. "Come back inside. Be there for Emma. One step at a time." Isabel looked at him, her defenses crumbling as she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "One step at a time." When they returned to the living room, Maggie was sitting with Emma on the floor, sorting through a puzzle. Emma looked up, her face lighting up as Isabel entered the room. "Are you okay?" Emma asked, her voice filled with childlike concern. Isabel knelt beside her, her movements slow but deliberate. "I'm okay," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And I'd like to help with the puzzle, if that's okay with you." Emma grinned, sliding a piece toward her. "Of course it's okay. You can do the edges. They're the hardest." Isabel smiled, a small but genuine expression that filled the room with warmth. Alex watched from the doorway, his chest swelling with hope. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but for the first time in years it felt possible. And for now, that was enough. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains of Maggie's kitchen, illuminating the table where Alex sat nursing his second cup of coffee. Across from him, Maggie flipped through her planner, her brow furrowed in thought as she jotted down notes. The house was unusually quiet. Emma was at school and Isabel was upstairs, still waking up from what Alex hoped had been a restful night. He glanced at Maggie, her focus so intent that she hadn't noticed his gaze. The slight crease in her brow and the way her lips pressed together spoke volumes. She was thinking, worrying, planning all at once. "What's on your mind?" Alex asked, breaking the silence. Maggie looked up, startled, and then smiled faintly. "Just trying to figure out how to balance everything. Between Isabel, Emma, and, well, you," she admitted, her tone light but edged with something deeper. Alex chuckled softly. "I didn't mean to add to your list of worries." "You didn't," Maggie said quickly, her expression softening. "It's not worry exactly. It's just a lot. Isabel being here, trying to reconnect with Emma. It's wonderful, but it's also fragile, like it could all fall apart at any moment." Alex nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "It is fragile," he agreed, "but that's why we're here, to help her through it." Maggie's lips curved into a small smile, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. "I just hope we're enough." Later that afternoon, Isabel joined them in the living room, looking more composed than Alex had seen her in days. She wore a soft gray sweater that seemed to envelop her, her hair pulled back into a loose braid. There was a quiet determination in her demeanor, as if she had decided to face the day with cautious optimism. "Morning," Alex said, his tone warm but casual. "Morning," Isabel replied, her voice steadier than usual. She hesitated before sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I was thinking, maybe Emma and I could do something together later. Just the two of us." Maggie and Alex exchanged a quick glance, their surprise evident. "That sounds like a great idea," Maggie said, her voice encouraging. "What do you have in mind?" "I don't know," Isabel admitted, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Maybe a walk in the park? Something simple." "Emma would love that," Alex said, his heart swelling with pride at Isabel's initiative. "She's been talking about the park all week." Isabel smiled faintly, her nerves still visible but tempered by resolve. "I just want to try," she said softly, "even if it's small." "It's not small," Maggie said, her voice gentle. "It's exactly what she needs." That afternoon, Isabel and Emma headed to the park, leaving Alex and Maggie alone in the house. The quiet was unusual, almost disconcerting, but it gave them a rare moment to breathe. They sat on the porch, the crisp winter air brushing against their faces. Maggie cradled a mug of tea in her hands, her fingers curling around the warmth. "She's trying," Maggie said, breaking the silence. "And I think she's starting to see that she can be a part of this." Alex nodded, his gaze distant as he watched the bare branches of the trees sway in the wind. "I'm proud of her," he said quietly. "But I can't shake the feeling that something's holding her back." Maggie studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "She's lived with so much fear for so long. It's hard to let that go, even when you want to." Alex turned to her, his brow furrowing. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying too much? Like you're the one holding everything together, and if you stop, it'll all fall apart?" Maggie's lips parted in surprise at his question, but she quickly composed herself. "Sometimes," she admitted, her voice softer now. "But I've learned that holding it together doesn't mean doing it alone, and neither should you." Her words settled over Alex like a warm blanket, both comforting and challenging. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," Maggie said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "But it's worth it." The air between them shifted, the tension giving way to something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. Alex's gaze lingered on her, his chest tightening with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. Hope. "Maggie," he began, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. "I don't know what this is between us, but I know I don't want to lose it." Maggie's breath hitched slightly, her cheeks flushing in the cold air. "Alex, I'm not saying we have to figure it out right now," he continued, his tone steady but earnest. "But I want you to know that you matter to me, more than I ever expected." Maggie looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a long moment. Then she smiled, a soft, genuine smile that sent warmth coursing through him. "You matter to me too," she said simply, her voice laced with quiet honesty. The moment stretched between them, fragile and full of promise, before Maggie turned her gaze back to the trees. Alex followed her lead, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. When Isabel and Emma returned later that evening, their cheeks pink from the cold, there was a new energy between them. Emma chattered excitedly about the ducks they had fed and the slide she had convinced Isabel to try. Isabel, though quieter, wore a small, proud smile that hinted at her growing confidence. "How was it?" Maggie asked, her tone bright as she set down a plate of cookies on the coffee table. "It was fun," Emma said, her grin wide. "Isabel even went down the slide. She screamed, but I think she liked it." Isabel laughed, a light, unguarded sound that filled the room. "I didn't scream," she said, her tone playful. "I expressed concern." Emma giggled, throwing her arms around Isabel in a sudden hug. "You're the best." The words hit Isabel with visible force, her smile faltering for a moment before she returned Emma's embrace. "You're pretty great too," she said softly. Alex watched the exchange, his chest swelling with pride and relief. For the first time, it felt like they were moving beyond the fractures of the past, building something real and lasting. And as the room filled with laughter and warmth, Alex allowed himself to believe that their fragile trust might just grow into something unbreakable. The estate glowed under the soft light of 1,000 twinkling lanterns strung across the garden. Guests moved gracefully among the tables, their laughter and conversation blending into the strains of a live quartet playing in the background. The evening was perfect, a celebration of both new beginnings and the bridges rebuilt over the last few weeks. Alex stood near the edge of the patio, a glass of champagne in his hand, watching as Isabel and Emma twirled together on the makeshift dance floor. Emma's giggles echoed through the crisp winter night as she led Isabel in an exaggerated spin. Isabel's laugh, once so rare and guarded, was now warm and unrestrained. It was a sound Alex had feared he might never hear again, and now it filled him with a pride and joy he couldn't put into words. "You did it," Maggie said, stepping beside him. Her voice was soft, but the admiration in her tone was unmistakable. "You brought her back." Alex turned to her, his gaze lingering. Maggie wore a deep emerald dress that complemented her auburn hair, which fell in loose waves over her shoulders. She looked stunning, but it was the quiet strength in her eyes that captivated him most. "I didn't do it alone," Alex replied, his voice steady. "You were there every step of the way." Maggie smiled, her cheeks tinged with the faintest blush. "You gave her the space to heal, Alex. That wasn't easy." "Neither was convincing you to give me a chance," he teased lightly, the corners of his mouth curving into a soft smile. Maggie laughed, her voice low and melodic. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Their banter hung between them, warm and unspoken truth simmering just beneath the surface. Alex reached for her hand, his touch light but purposeful. "Maggie," he said, his tone growing serious, "I couldn't have done any of this without you. You believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself, and you've been more to me than I ever thought I could deserve." Maggie's breath caught, her gaze locking with his. "Alex, I know this hasn't been easy for you," he continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I want you to know that this isn't just about Isabel or Emma. It's about us, about what we've built together." Maggie's lips parted, but before she could respond, Emma's voice interrupted them. "Alex," she called, running toward him. "Come dance with us." He laughed, releasing Maggie's hand reluctantly. "Duty calls." Maggie watched as he scooped Emma up, spinning her around as her laughter rang out across the garden. Isabel joined in, her smile wide and genuine, and for a moment, Maggie simply stood there, taking it all in. The laughter, the warmth, the love that had grown between them all. Later in the evening, after the guests had filtered out and the garden had grown quiet, the family lingered around a fire pit, its flames crackling softly in the night. Isabel sat beside Emma, the two of them wrapped in a shared blanket, while Alex and Maggie stood a few feet away, watching the scene unfold. "She's happy," Maggie said softly, nodding toward Isabel. "You gave her that." Alex shook his head. "She found her own way. I just reminded her she didn't have to do it alone." Maggie smiled, tilting her head to look up at him. "Still, you've changed, Alex. You've grown into someone who sees the value in things that money can't buy." "I had a good teacher," he replied, his tone filled with warmth. "You showed me what it means to really connect with people, Maggie, to let them in." Maggie stepped closer, her hand brushing against his arm. "And what have you learned?" "That the things that matter most aren't things at all," Alex said, his voice quieter now. "They're people, family, love." Maggie's gaze softened, and in that moment Alex knew he couldn't let another day pass without showing her how much she meant to him. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. "Maggie," he began, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart, "I know this wasn't the life you planned, and I know it hasn't been perfect. But I also know that I can't imagine my life without you in it." Maggie's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth as he opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "I don't want to just rebuild my family," Alex continued. "I want to build a future. With you. Maggie, will you marry me?" For a moment, Maggie was too stunned to speak. Her eyes glistened with tears, her lips trembling as she smiled. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Alex, I'll marry you." Relief and joy flooded through him as he slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her into a tight embrace. The applause that erupted behind them startled them both, and they turned to see Isabel and Emma grinning from ear to ear. "About time," Isabel teased, her voice filled with warmth. Emma ran forward, throwing her arms around Maggie and Alex. "Does this mean we're a real family now?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent hope. Alex knelt to her level, his heart swelling. "We've always been a real family, Emma, but now it's official." As they all laughed and hugged, Alex felt a profound sense of peace settle over him. The journey to this moment had been anything but easy, but it had been worth every challenge, every doubt, every step. He had found his sister, rediscovered the meaning of family, and opened his heart to love in ways he never thought possible. And as the firelight danced around them, Alex knew that this was just the beginning. A new chapter filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future they would build together.